For over 40 years, a predator walked among us, smiling in photos, raising a family, attending church, and hiding an unspeakable secret. What if the man living next door, the one who coached your daughter's team or handed out candy at Halloween, had already killed before and got away with it? This is the story of John Getreu, a man who seemed ordinary until DNA pulled back the mask. But the real question isn't just how he got away with it for so long, it's why no one stopped him after the first time. By the end of this story, you'll see just how terrifyingly close evil can live, and you'll never look at your neighbors the same way again. It's 1973 in Palo Alto, California. A quiet, affluent town known for Stanford University and its sense of safety. The kind of place where neighbors wave from across picket fences and kids ride their bikes to school. That October, 21-year-old Janet and Taylor, the daughter of a Stanford graduate, is walking along a wooded path near campus. It's early evening. Cool, crisp, and quiet. She never makes it home. The next morning, her body is found beneath a eucalyptus tree. Strangled. Dumped. Left like trash. No signs of robbery. No sexual assault. No witnesses. No leads. Just a rising sense of panic in a town that never expected to feel unsafe. But this isn't where the story really starts. Because 2 years earlier, in a different country, a teenage girl died in eerily similar circumstances. And the man who would one day move to Palo Alto? He was already hiding in plain sight, and already had blood on his hands. Back in 1963 in Bad Kreuznach, West Germany, a U.S. Army base buzzed with activity. Military families and enlisted men made their lives among the barracks and small-town European streets. 15-year-old Margaret Lacey Williams, daughter of a senior Army sergeant, was popular and bright. She agreed to meet 18-year-old John Getreu, the son of another military officer, for a casual evening walk. She never came home. Her body was found the next day in a wooded area, brutalized and beaten. She had been raped, then strangled. Bruises marked her neck. Her clothing was torn. Authorities quickly zeroed in on Getreu. He had been the last to see Margaret alive. After hours of interrogation, he confessed. Despite the cruelty of the crime, the sentence was shockingly light. Just 10 years. And he served only 6. The German juvenile justice system deemed him a first-time offender. A young man deserving of another chance. And that's exactly what he got. He returned to the United States with a new name, a clean slate, and a dark past he never spoke of. America never knew. But what happens when you give a killer a second chance, and he uses it to kill again? After his release, Getreu quietly resettled in the U.S. He got married, had children, took a job, joined the Boy Scouts as a leader, became active in his local church. By the late 1970s, he was living just outside of Palo Alto, less than 15 miles from where Janet Taylor had been murdered in 1973. To anyone looking in, he was a family man, a good neighbor, a mentor. But behind the mask, the monster remained. Over the next decade, 2 more women, Leslie Perlov, 21 in 1973, and Christine Denevy, 17 in 1975, were found murdered in nearby areas. All young women. All strangled. All left in secluded wooded spots. No robbery. No DNA matches. No leads. No arrests. Authorities believed a serial killer might be on the loose, but they had nothing concrete. No fingerprints. No witness statements. No viable suspects. And John Getreu went on living, quietly, comfortably in the shadows. Decades would pass before science finally caught up with the lies. And when it did, it uncovered far more than anyone expected. In 2018, a 45-year-old cold case suddenly ignited. A preserved DNA sample from the 1973 murder of Leslie Perlov, one that had been sitting untouched in evidence storage for decades, was uploaded into a public genealogy site called GeneMatch. The new method, known as genetic genealogy, combined DNA profiles with public ancestry databases. Within weeks, the sample hit. A partial match pointed to a family tree. At the center of it stood John Arthur Getreu, now in his 70s and living quietly in Hayward, California. Retired. Quiet. Unassuming. Just another old man on the block. But when investigators started digging, they found more than they bargained for. Military records from Germany. The 1963 rape and murder. The name of a girl long forgotten, Margaret Williams. And then something more recent. Evidence linking him not only to Leslie Perlov, but also to Janet Taylor. 2 victims. 2 different crime scenes. 2 matching DNA samples. When authorities brought him in, Getreu appeared calm. Almost relaxed. He denied everything. But the evidence was overwhelming. The genealogy hits. The crime scene samples. Historical records. Eyewitness notes. The facade cracked. In 2018, John Getreu was arrested for the murder of Leslie Perloff. In 2019, he was charged with the murder of Janet Taylor. And yet, these weren't the only lives he had taken. Because the more investigators searched, the darker the picture became. Multiple women. Multiple counties. A timeline stretching across half a century. Just when authorities thought they'd uncovered everything, another victim emerged. A teenager. A brutal death. And a case that had never been tied to Getreu, until now. Christine Denevy was just 17 when she vanished in 1975 after attending a church youth event in Santa Clara County. Her body was found weeks later, strangled and left in a shallow creek bed. No suspects. No arrests. The case went cold almost immediately. But now, decades later, investigators revisited the case. Witness statements. Handwriting samples. An anonymous phone call to Christine's family days after her disappearance, believed to be from the killer himself. And then an old anonymous tip from the 1980s, buried in paperwork, mentioned Getreu by name. At the time, no one followed up. Now, with fresh eyes and modern tools, everything pointed back to him. Could Christine have been another victim? And if so, how many more were out there? Next time we go deeper. Into the mind of a killer who fooled everyone. Into the courtroom where survivors finally faced him. And into the haunting question that still lingers. Did John Getreu act alone? Or was there something darker at work? Something we still don't know? They say the courtroom is where truth comes to light. But when John Getreu stood trial, the truth was already decades old, buried beneath layers of lies, second chances, and missed warnings. After his 2018 arrest for the 1973 murder of Leslie Perloff, and his subsequent 2019 charge for the killing of Janet Taylor, the families of both victims were left to face a gut-wrenching question. How had this man been free for so long? How had he escaped justice in not just one but two separate countries? Getreu, now in his 70s, walked into court slow and quiet, white-haired, slumped, looking more like someone's grandfather than the violent predator he'd proven to be. But to the families sitting just feet away, he was the face of grief that never aged. Their daughters never had a chance to grow old. But he had. The prosecution laid out the evidence piece by piece, starting with the DNA. It was irrefutable. The genetic material from both murder scenes, Perloff and Taylor, matched Getreu's profile. They recounted the chilling pattern. Women, all young, all strangled, all dumped in secluded areas near Stanford University. A calculated killer who left no fingerprints, no weapons, and no trace beyond what time and luck eventually revealed. But the most shocking moment came when prosecutors unveiled his original crime. Margaret Lacey Williams. 1963, West Germany. 15 years old. Raped and strangled by a then 18-year-old Getreu, who served just 6 years before being released. You could hear the silence in the courtroom. It wasn't just outrage. It was horror. A man with a proven history of murder had simply moved on, got married, raised children, joined a church, and kept on killing. This wasn't just a case of delayed justice. This was a system failure. The defense tried to lean into his age, citing frailty, the loss of memory, and the idea that his past no longer defined the man he had become. But every family member in the gallery saw through it. One by one they took the stand. Mothers, siblings, old friends who'd carried wounds for nearly half a century. They spoke of birthdays missed, empty chairs at holidays, unanswered questions that haunted them through every major life event. One of Janet Taylor's sisters looked directly at Getreu and said, "You stole her future and you got to live yours. That's not justice." And still, through all of it, Getreu sat silent, emotionless, his eyes cold, his demeanor almost mechanical, as if none of it touched him, as if he'd done this before. But then came the next wave of revelations. While digging deeper into his past, authorities discovered Getreu had worked as a youth counselor for troubled teens during the 1980s. He had access to vulnerable girls, many of whom were never properly interviewed. Several had disturbing stories, inappropriate behavior, strange comments. One recalled waking up at a retreat to find him sitting on the edge of her bunk, watching her sleep. None of it had been reported at the time. And now it was too late to verify. The question lingered, how many more victims might there have been? The judge moved swiftly. The weight of evidence left little room for ambiguity. In 2021, John Getreu was sentenced to life in prison for the murders of Leslie Perloff and Janet Taylor. At long last, justice, at least officially, had been served. But the story didn't end there. A few weeks after the verdict, a retired detective in Santa Clara reopened a box that had been sitting in cold storage since 1975. The box was labeled simply, K. Denevi. Inside were photos, interview notes, and a letter addressed to Christine Denevi's parents, sent anonymously a week after her body was discovered. The handwriting was stiff, slanted, and chilling in its vagueness. I saw what happened to your daughter. I wish I could say more. But the man who did it, he's still around. The letter was dismissed back then. A prank, perhaps. But now its tone felt eerily familiar. A handwriting expert was called in. The letter was compared to samples from Getreu's military and scouting records. Was a match. The possibility that he'd contacted the family of a victim post-mortem wasn't just disturbing, it was sadistic. And it posed a new question. Was he taunting them? Or was it something even darker, some twisted attempt at inserting himself into the grief? Getreu never admitted to the Denevi killing. He denied even knowing her name. But to detectives the pattern was there. And behind the pattern, intent. By now his name had become a cold case keyword. Dozens of unsolved strangulations across California from the 70s and 80s were being re-evaluated through a new lens. Could Getreu have been involved? In one instance, a high school senior named Melanie R. vanished after a bus ride home from a track meet in 1979. Her body was found weeks later, strangled, fully clothed, dumped in the woods outside Oakland. The case never connected to anyone. Until a witness came forward, an old friend from church who remembered that Getreu had been very interested in Melanie and once offered her a ride home. That file is now under review. DNA testing is pending. Meanwhile, Getreu sits in a California prison. Alone. Unapologetic. Unmoved. To this day he has never confessed. He has never written an apology letter. He has never said the names of his victims out loud. What makes someone like John Getreu so terrifying isn't just the violence, it's the silence. The way he disappeared into society, wore its mask and fooled everyone around him. Neighbors called him friendly. His pastor described him as reserved but respectful. His own family had no idea. But maybe the most chilling detail of all came from a court-appointed psychologist who reviewed Getreu's past for the record. His report included a single sentence that still echoes in the minds of those who read it. He presents as someone who doesn't believe he's done anything wrong, only that he was unfortunate enough to get caught. In other words, if he hadn't been identified through DNA and genealogy, there's a real chance he'd still be out there. Free. Waiting. Watching. And perhaps worst of all, still hunting. But the story isn't over. Because there are still cold cases left open. Still mothers and fathers and siblings without answers. And still, one terrifying question no one can quite answer. Did John Getreu really act alone all those years? Or is there another name, still hidden in the dark? Still waiting to be revealed? In the months following John Getreu's conviction, there was a sense, however fleeting, that justice had finally caught up with the past. Families began to breathe again. News cameras stopped showing up outside the courthouse. The name John Getreu, once spoken with dread, started to fade from headlines. But inside California's Department of Justice, the name was anything but forgotten. Cold case units, re-energized by his arrest and conviction, began combing through hundreds of unsolved cases spanning the 1970s and 1980s, each with disturbing similarities. Young women. Strangulation. Woodland dump sites. No witnesses. No arrests. Some were barely more than a paragraph in old police logs. Others had long been assumed to be isolated, tragic crimes. Now they were potential threads in Getreu's web. One of the first reopened files belonged to 19-year-old Sarah Donner, a community college student who vanished in 1974 after leaving a library in San Mateo. Her body was discovered 10 days later in a grove behind a golf course, strangled with a shoelace. There were no signs of sexual assault. No fingerprints. Nothing to go on. Until a single thread of nylon, preserved for decades in a sealed bag, was sent for modern DNA analysis. The results came back partial. Degraded. Not admissible in court. But the Y-chromosomal DNA pointed to the same male lineage as Getreu. It wasn't enough to prosecute. But it was enough to believe. Over the next year, investigators created a chart on a whiteboard, pinning photographs and dates in chronological order. A grim timeline stretching from 1963 Germany to 1975 California. Sarah Donner. Christine Denevi. Janet Taylor. Leslie Perloff. Margaret Williams. All young. All victims of a man who vanished after each kill, only to reappear under a different name, a different story. And yet, even now, even with so much uncovered, Getreu refused to speak. When asked during an appeal process whether he felt remorse, he simply stared ahead. "I've made peace with my life," he said. "I have nothing to add." It was the closest thing to a statement he ever gave. While investigators continued working the files, families found themselves stuck between resolution and uncertainty. The legal closure had arrived, but emotionally, many remained suspended, trapped in the murky space between knowing and never fully understanding. One of the most haunting moments came from the family of Christine Denevy. Her mother, now in her late 80s, had kept every letter, every news clipping, and every unanswered lead from the investigation. After Getreu's arrest, she finally boxed it all up and sealed it away. "Closure isn't about answers," she told a local reporter. "It's about deciding not to let the pain speak louder than the love." And yet, for some, answers still mattered. A survivor named Melissa, who asked that her last name be withheld, came forward in early 2022. She had attended one of Getreu's youth retreats in the early 1980s and remembered an incident that haunted her for decades. She had fallen asleep in a bunkhouse after lights out. At some point in the night, she awoke to find Getreu kneeling next to her bed. His hand was resting on her arm. She couldn't move, paralyzed with fear. He didn't speak. He just looked at her. Then quietly walked away. Melissa told no one at the time. Who would believe a teenager accusing a church leader, an army veteran, a father, of something so vague? After hearing the news about his arrest, the memory returned with force. She wasn't assaulted. She wasn't hurt. But the look in his eyes, she said, was unforgettable. Like he was deciding something. Stories like Melissa's never made it into police files. They existed in the gaps, in the silent moments, the near misses, the things that almost happened. And it was in these gray areas that the full picture of John Getreu finally began to take shape. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a man who understood camouflage, who adapted, observed, mimicked normalcy so well that he vanished into it. He became what people needed him to be. A mentor. A husband. A volunteer. A ghost. His crimes were not crimes of passion. They were controlled. Cold. Calculated. The violence was precise. The dumping grounds were remote. He never returned to a crime scene. He never reached out to gloat. Not openly. Except once. A letter, sent to the Denevy family after Christine's death, matched his handwriting. That single slip may have been the only time the mask cracked. Psychologists reviewing Getreu's behavior noted that he fit the profile of a dissociative predator. Someone capable of committing extreme violence without internalizing it. He could go home, eat dinner, tuck in his children, and sleep. No remorse. No conflict. Just silence. In the end, Getreu was linked, directly or by pattern, to at least 6 murders. Only 2 resulted in convictions. The others remain cold. Their victims' names now sit on a digital archive under cases of interest. And John Getreu? He died in prison on September 22, 2023. Natural causes. No final confession. No letter to the families. No names revealed. No truth spoken. He took his secrets with him. But he left behind something else, something far more enduring than silence. He left behind a warning. That evil doesn't always wear a monster's face. Sometimes it smiles at you in church, coaches your kids, pays taxes, volunteers. Sometimes it's the last person you'd suspect. And sometimes it walks away, again and again, until time or science finally catches up. After Getreu's death, one of the lead investigators was asked if the case had changed him. His answer was quiet. "I used to think we could see it coming," he said. "Now I know better. You don't always see evil coming. Sometimes, it waves as it passes by." For the families of the victims, there will never be full peace. Only the knowledge that the man who haunted them for decades is finally gone. But for law enforcement, cold case detectives, and anyone watching from the outside, Getreu's story isn't just a true crime tale. It's a reminder that the past is never truly buried. That killers don't always look like killers. And that justice, no matter how long it takes, can still find its way through the dark. If this story gripped you, if you believe the past should never stay buried, then help us keep these voices alive. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the truth doesn't rest. And neither do we.